Hello there, you're welcome to HitGov TV, and my name is Collins Nanaya Abebrese. So in this video, we are going to look at the Guggisberg Constitution of 1925. We have been looking at the constitutional development over the period, and so if you happens to not have watched our previous lessons on the constitutional development, I would like to recommend the videos for you. You can check that in our videos, SHS 3 or year 12. Now, in our previous discussions on the constitutional development, we looked at the 1916 Constitution, which was promulgated by Hugh Clifford, and we looked at some of the compositions of the Executive and the Legislative Council, as well as the limitations of that Constitution. So, by way of reminding ourselves of some of the things so that we can build on that to learn our new lesson for today, we said that the Legislative Council are comprised of 21 members in the 1916 Constitution. We said that 12 of these members were official and 9 were unofficial members. So within the unofficial members, we had 3 who were Europeans, we had 3 who were paramount chiefs, and these paramount chiefs were Nana Ufuriata, who represented the Tree-speaking people, Nana Amwakon Kwesi of Anmabo, who also represented the Fanti people, and then also Togosre, who also represented the Ewe, and then the other 3 were educated elite. However, in the Executive Council, we realized that in the 1916 Clifford Constitution, it lacked African membership. And so obviously, the educated elite were not going to be happy with the composition of both the Executive and the Legislative Council. Hence, it came with it some kind of backlash from the educated elite. And so they still, the educated elite still, complain of the fact that there is still no elective principle. People are not allowed to vote. The public is not allowed to vote. So it means that all the members in both the Executive and the Legislative Council were all appointed by the Europeans or the governors, and that was quite undemocratic, for them. Now again, they also say that these 1916 Constitution still lacked Asante. So Asante has not been represented yet still in the 1916 Constitution, and more so the veto power of the government was still in place, and therefore this calls for a new constitution to be promulgated. So that's just by way of reminding ourselves of our previous discussions. You can check that for a full video on that. So today let's take a look at the 1925 Constitution, which was also promulgated by Governor Frederick Gardner Guggisberg. Now, this constitution was promulgated by Governor Frederick Gardner Guggisberg, and this man has been labeled as the best colonial, governor in the Gold Coast. Now, let's take a look at our lesson objectives for today. So, by the end of our discussions, you should be able to discuss the features of the Guggisberg Constitution of 1925. And then also outline the strength or the merits of the Guggisberg Constitution of 1925, and also state the limitations or weaknesses of the Guggisberg Constitution of 1925. So as I earlier on say, even today in our 92 Constitution, there are still some weaknesses and limitations that needs to be changed or amended. So this is our lesson objectives. Let's go in there and find out if the aspirations of the educated elite being the weaknesses or the limitations of the 1916 Constitution, whether it is going to be fulfilled. Is Guggisberg going to fulfill the idea of elective principle, the idea of veto power, the idea of adding Asante and the Northern Territory to be part of the colony, and some of the weaknesses as found in the 1916 Constitution, and most importantly, no African or no African membership on the Executive Council. Let's find out how Guggisberg solved these issues. Now, let's begin with our introduction. So the Clifford Constitution fell short of the aspirations of the Aborigines Rights Protection Society and the National Congress of British West Africa, because it refused to introduce the elective principle of representation in the Legislative Council. Come on, you cannot appoint people to represent people in the Legislative Council. I think that is quite undemocratic. And so the educated elite were much concerned with the elective principle. That's the right to elect the public, giving the public or the citizenry the right to vote and elect their own leaders. So let's go in there and look at more on the introduction. So on taking over the governorship of the Gold Coast in 1919, Guggisberg initiated some changes in the political development of the country in a bid to reduce the agitation of the nationalists, right? After consulting the Aborigines Rights Protection Society and prominent traditional rulers, he promulgated a new constitution in 1925, which is called the Guggisberg Constitution, and that's what we are looking at. So let's begin with the features of the Guggisberg Constitution. What were the features? Let's first of all take a look at the Legislative Council. All right. Now, the Guggisberg Constitution gave the right of elective representation. It provided for 15 officials and 14 unofficial members in the Legislative Council. So when you compare this to the 1916 Constitution, you realize that there has been some sort of changes or improvement in the 1916 Constitution. Now, here, for Guggisberg gives the right of elective representation. So now the public is going to get a chance to vote and elect through election, elect their leaders to represent them in the Legislative Council. However, when you also take a look at the membership of the 1925 Constitution, there has been an increase, unlike the 1916 Constitution where we had 12 official members. Here we have 3 being added. Also, we had 9 unofficial members, if you could recall. Here we have 14, which means more and more members or people have been added to the Legislative Council, and that is quite an improvement. Let's take a look at the next features of the Legislative Council. The unofficial membership was made up of 5 Europeans. In 1916, it was made up of 3 Europeans. Here, it is 5 Europeans. Now, 3 were nominated, so 3 of the 5 were nominated by the governor, and 2 also represented mining and commercial interest. All right, and then the remaining 9 were Africans. Just imagine, the remaining 9 were Africans. So you could see that in the 1916 Constitution, there were only 6 African membership in the Legislative Council, being the paramount chiefs, 3 paramount chiefs, which represented the Tree, Fanti, and the Ewe-speaking people, and then also 3 educated elites. So there were only 6 African membership. Whereas in the 1925 Constitution, we've had 9 Africans in there. All right, I think that is also quite an improvement on the 1916 Constitution. Now, let's take a look at the membership of the African, the African membership. Let's take a look at them. 3 were elected on property franchise. So people who own properties were allowed to vote. And that is what we mean by elected on property franchise. If you had property, you own a land or something of that sort, you were allowed to vote. So 3 of these out of the 9 Africans were voted for. Now, 3 out of these to represent, so the 3 that were voted for were to represent Accra, and they were the 3 municipalities at that time: Accra, Cape Coast, and Sekondi. All right. Now the remaining 6, so the remaining 6 were elected by the newly created Provincial Council of Chiefs, and I call it PCC, the newly created Provincial Council of Chiefs, to improve the native administration in the Western, Central, and Eastern province. In those days, the Gold Coast was divided into Western, Central, and Eastern province. This excluding Ashanti. Ashanti Kingdom, was not part, but the Gold Coast, along the coast, they had divided it into Central, East, and West. Now, Guggisberg also introduced something new here. He introduced the Provincial Council of Chiefs, where he created a council for the chiefs. And also don't forget that this was in a bid to enforce the indirect rule policy, which the British had been pioneering, had introduced in the Gold Coast. So these newly created Provincial Council of Chiefs, they were a council made up of only what? Chiefs. And their responsibility was to actually elect the other 6 members, which I presume 2 for each of the two for each of the provinces, of course, which is the Western, Central, and then the Eastern. I said Ashanti was not part, so this Eastern and Western and Central province was the Gold Coast, the southern state, which had been divided into 3. And this is quite interesting, right? Yeah. Now, Ashanti and the Northern Territories and the British mandated Togoland had no representation, as these territories were governed by a separate set of laws made by the governor himself. So again, Ashanti, the Northern Territories, that's Northern Ghana today, and the British mandated Togoland, which is part of Northern Ghana and then the Volta area, had not been added to the Legislative Council. They were governed differently by the governor. So this is the membership of the Legislative Council. I don't know your thoughts on that, but you can analyze it well and look at the weakness, all right, and the strength of this council, and that will take us to the Executive Council. But we'll come back and look at the weaknesses of that. But then bear in mind that when you look at the membership, you still find more chiefs. Chiefs are 6, as opposed to the educated elites who have been given only 3 slots. So obviously the membership of the educated elite has not been increased. From the 1916 constitution, it has been 3, and here same 3. You realize that the British were keen on bringing in the chiefs into political administration, basically because of their policy of indirect rule. They cared more for the chiefs than the educated elite. Now let's move on to this. Is just a table for you to make it all simple. So we have 21 membership, both official and unofficial, in the Legislative Council. We have 15 official members, and then we have 14 unofficial members. Out of these 14, 5 are Europeans and 9 are Africans. Now, out of these 5 Europeans, 2 were representing mining and commercial interests. Then 3 were also nominated by the governor. Now, out of these 9 African members, we had 6 who were appointed by the Provincial Council of Chiefs, and then we also had 3 who were also the educated elite, who also represented Accra for Cape Coast and Sekondi, and these were the Eastern, Central, and then the Western province. So this was the composition of the Legislative Council, and you can compare this composition to that of the 1916 Constitution, and you can come up with your own issues. Now let's take a look at the Executive Council. Remember, in the 1915 Constitution, there were 6, 1916 rather, there were 6 membership, no African membership. Let's take a look at the Executive Council in 1925. Now, the Executive Council, however, continued to preserve the Europeans, as it was still composed of the governor and 5 British officials of the most important department. The council was responsible for the day-to-day administration of the Gold Coast. All right. Now, so you see that the Executive Council, don't forget that the Executive Council it was the most important council. Decisions were actually taken over there. So not to have African membership was quite problematic. Okay. And so the membership in the Executive Council had not changed. I think it's still 6, the governor, and then 5 British official membership, still 6. And the 1916 constitution was still 6. So I think there wasn't any change in the executive council. Now let's take a look at the merits before we even look at what is on the slides. You can come up with some of the merits, looking at the weaknesses in the 1916 constitution, what has been fulfilled, what changes have been made in the 1925 constitution, and that should be the merit that you can give, all right, being it in the number, the membership, the number in the membership of the legislative council, and certain changes. So let's take a look at some of the advantages or the merits. One was that it increased the membership of the legislative council from 20 to 30 members. Remember, we said 21 because the governor was part of the legislative council. So 20 to 30 now, we have 30 in the executive, in the legislative council, in the Guggisberg constitution. And I think that was very good, for the country. Now, it also granted the people of the Gold Coast the elective principle to elect representatives to the legislative council in the municipalities of Accra, Cape Coast, and Second D. So the Guggisberg Constitution was the first constitution that introduced the elective principle, a right for the public to elect their own leaders, and these leaders were to represent the municipalities of Accra, Cape Coast, and Second D, so the Western, Eastern, and the Central province. Only 3 were to be elected, and I think that was that was a merit or an advantage, all right, in the 1925 constitution, because it was obviously not found in the 1916 constitution. Then it also established the Provincial Council of Chiefs to ensure the application of indirect rule in the Gold Coast. So you realize that the British were keen on involving the chiefs in local administration. Some people will argue that it was a good thing to do, but also don't forget that they were doing this because of certain reasons, and those reasons were not in favor of the Gold Coasters. It was just in their favor. So they were doing that because they would benefit. If they wouldn't have benefited from using the chiefs, there is no way they were going to allow the chiefs to be in colonial administration. And so today people are also complaining that chiefs have become redundant because they are not included in politics or in the administration of the country, and I think that is a whole debate on itself. But let's not argue that the Europeans were rather including the chiefs, but then when Africans came, Nkrumah and Co came, they took away all the chiefs and all of that. Europeans were doing this for their own selfish interest. Let's take a look at the weaknesses. Now, one of the weaknesses is that the Executive Council still continued to be official membership, without the native unofficial representation. So there was no African membership. In short, the Executive Council did not have any African membership, and that is quite also worrying. All right, both Ashanti and the Northern Territories were also excluded in the representations of the Legislative Council. Do you remember that both Ashanti and the Northern Territories were ruled directly by the governor? So they were not part of the 1925 constitution. So they didn't have a constitution then, and we believe that according to the educated elite, all the territories under the British colony were to have come together instead of giving them a different political representation. The elective principle was also based on property franchise, which was quite undemocratic. Remember, we said that even though Guggisberg did well by introducing the elective principle, there is this also argument that that elective principle was based on was based on property franchise. if you didn't have property, you were not allowed to vote, and that wasn't democratic. Why? Because a lot of people didn't have, for property, so it wasn't a universal adult suffrage. It wasn't, universal. It was just limited to some few group of people, and that was still undemocratic, right? I think everybody at the voting age, the universal adult suffrage, should be allowed to vote instead of just limiting it to only a few people. But of course, it also is an advantage because it was first introduced, election was first introduced in there. Now, the constitution also fell short of the expectations of the educated elite due to the large representation given to the chiefs. For instance, led by J.E. Castle Hayford, he argued that by their education, they and not the illiterate chiefs should be recognized as the true representation of the people. And this premises, are cause for a wider debate. You recall that in the 1916 Constitution, I told you, or we learned that only 3 membership was given to the educated elite. The chiefs also got 3. However, in the 1925 Constitution, because Guggisberg wanted to introduce the indirect rule policy, the seats for the chiefs were increased from 3 to 3, 100%. Educated elite were, their seats were remained at 3. So the educated elite were actually not happy, and they felt that by their education they were to represent the people. They were the true representatives of the people instead of the chiefs. I don't know how you would argue out that. Which people do you think represented the people at the time of the colonial rule, period? Which people do you think represented the chiefs? Was it the educated elite or the chiefs? Because the chiefs, don't forget, the British came to meet the chiefs already in position of leading the people, representing the people. But J.E. Castle Hayford and some of the educated elite are arguing that some of these chiefs are not educated, so they can't represent the people. Do you think that is really, true? And there are so many arguments around this whole, premises, and I don't want to go there. So you can begin the discussions in the comment section if you think that the chiefs are to represent the people, or it is the people, it is the educated elite who are supposed to represent the people. So yeah, I think that is that. We've had a very interesting conversation here. I know you love the lesson. Do not forget to share our link, subscribe to this channel, and have a nice day. Bye bye.